was early Christmas morning. The air was crisp, cold, and pure, the kind of winter morning that feels almost sacred. John Riley mounted his bicycle and rode away from a picturesque little village where he had spent the night. Frost clung lightly to the fields. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys in the distance. Today, his journey would take him through eastern Pennsylvania, toward a place heavy with history. Valley Forge. According to his road map, it was not far ahead, and beyond it lay the Schuylkill Valley, dotted with landmarks that whispered stories of the past. As he pedaled forward, Riley could not help but think about the winter of year 1777. The winter when General George Washington and his half-starved army endured unimaginable hardship on these very hills. 126 years ago, men had marched, suffered, and survived where he now rode freely under a peaceful sky. The contrast struck him. It was a beautiful Christmas day. The sun climbed slowly, casting pale golden light over rolling fields and quiet country roads. Quaint farmhouses appeared now and then along the way, sturdy, weathered structures that might very well have stood here even before the Revolution. They seemed like silent witnesses to history. Yet Riley's thoughts were not entirely on the past. At home, his family would be gathering around the Christmas tree at that very moment. Laughter filling the parlor, gifts stacked beneath branches heavy with ornaments and candles. He could almost see it, almost hear it, but the road called him forward. Eventually, he reached a fork. Two roads stretched out before him, both equally uncertain. Unsure which path led toward Valley Forge, Riley noticed a dwelling nearby. It stood some distance back from the road. He dismounted, leaned his bicycle against a gatepost, and made his way up a poorly laid stone walk toward the house, hoping to ask for directions. The place stood alone in an unkempt field of tall, rank grass and weeds. It was long and low, a single-story structure with a gabled roof and what must have been a sizable attic beneath. At first glance, it seemed merely old, but as he approached, a realization crept over him. The house was deserted. The roof shingles were broken and warped. The siding was cracked and splintered. Window frames gaped empty, the glass long gone. Doors were missing entirely, leaving dark openings that stared outward like hollow eyes. Even the stone foundation bore deep cracks and seams. It looked as though time, and perhaps something more, had claimed it. Riley hesitated. For a moment, he considered turning back, but curiosity stirred within him. After all, he had come this far. What harm could there be in taking just one look inside? And with that thought, he stepped closer to the abandoned house. Accordingly, he went inside. The room he entered was large and thick with dust. For a moment, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw nothing of the least interest. The air felt stale, undisturbed for years. Along one wall stood a rickety set of steps leading up to the attic. In a corner yawned a large, open fireplace, its brickwork crumbling, sections loosened and fallen away. The hearth was littered with broken mortar and debris. Riley had already placed his foot upon the first step and begun ascending toward the attic when something made him glance back. There, on the hearth, half buried beneath loose bricks and gray mortar, lay a curious little bottle. It was shaped like a jug, no larger than a vinegar cruet, resting on its side as though forgotten long ago. He descended the steps at once. Crossing the room quickly, he stooped and lifted the bottle. It was partly filled with some kind of liquid. Curiosity overcame caution. He pulled out the cork and raised the neck to his nose. A strange odor met him, pungent, sharp, and yet oddly inviting. Without hesitation, he pressed the bottle to his lips. It would be impossible to describe the sensation that followed. Pleasure, warmth, an extraordinary satisfaction flooded his senses as the liquid gurgled down his throat. And then, A heavy hand fell suddenly upon his shoulder. He was shaken violently. The bottle slipped from his grasp, crashed upon the floor, and shattered into 100 glittering fragments. "Hello," came a rough voice close to his ear. "Who are you, anyway? And what are you doing within the lines?" "A spy, I'll be bound." Riley's heart leapt. There had been no one in or near the building when he entered. Of that he was certain. No one had come down from the attic. No door had opened. And yet, someone stood behind him. Instinctively, he struggled to free himself from the iron grip. At last, he twisted loose and spun around. What he saw froze him in astonishment. There were 4 other people in the room. 3 rough-looking men stood before him. Uncouth fellows dressed in fantastic but ragged garments. Beside them, near the fireplace, stood a matronly woman. She was bent over a washtub elevated upon 2 chairs. Her sleeves were rolled above her shoulders. Her arms dripped with water and soap suds. Fabrics, thoroughly soaked, hung over the rim of the tub. She had evidently paused in her work to watch the confrontation. But that was not all. The fireplace, which moments ago had been crumbling and desolate, now appeared clean and solid. A cheerful fire burned within it. Above the flames hung an iron pot, from which a steady jet of steam arose. Riley stared in disbelief. The entire room had changed. What had been ruined was now whole. The ceiling was sound, the walls freshly intact. Doors were hung and painted. Window sashes filled the openings. Even the stairway to the attic appeared sturdy and secure. Under his very eyes, the apartment had transformed from decay and abandonment into order and habitation, as though time itself had reversed, as though he no longer stood in the present at all. All of this was so strange, so utterly uncanny, that Riley stood for several seconds in the transformed apartment, speechless. His mouth hung open. His eyes seemed ready to start from their sockets. The crumbling ruin he had entered was gone. In its place stood a neat, orderly, inhabited room. It was beyond reason. He was brought sharply back to himself by the same rough fellow who had seized him. "Come, explain yourself," the man growled. Riley swallowed. "An explanation is due me," he managed to gasp. "Don't bandy words with the rascal. Harry," one of the others broke in harshly. "Bring him along to headquarters." There was no further discussion. The 3 men surrounded him and, with military firmness, marched him out of the house and down toward the road. Riley's mind raced. At the gatepost, he quickly seized his bicycle, and in that instant another astonishment struck him. Close by stood a stack of 3 old-fashioned muskets. They had not been there when he entered the house. He was certain of it. As the men lifted the weapons and shouldered them, he cast one more look back at the dwelling. The exterior, like the interior, had undergone the same impossible transformation. No longer dilapidated and falling apart, it now stood straight, sound, and newly preserved, as though time had reversed its decay. What agency could have done this? He could not comprehend it. They marched him steadily down the road. As they went, the men showed remarkable interest in the bicycle he pushed beside him. They handled it with rough curiosity, running coarse fingers over the frame and handlebars. They examined the wheels, the pedals, the chain, peering at it as though it were some contrivance never before seen. Riley stared at them in disbelief. A bicycle unknown to them? He could scarcely believe that in all the country there were 3 men so unfamiliar with such a common piece of machinery. Yet their curiosity appeared entirely genuine. And as they studied the wheel, Riley in turn studied his captors. They were large men, rough, broad of frame, unshaven, and grimy of face. Their clothing, what remained of it, was astonishingly ragged, yet cut in a most peculiar fashion. The garments resembled, almost exactly, those worn by Continental militiamen during the War of Independence. Their hats were broad and low-crowned, three-cornered in shape. Their trousers, buff-colored, ended at the knee. Over these they wore long blue coats with spiked tailbacks. The tails flapped and fastened down with large brass buttons. Leather leggings were strapped over heavy cowhide boots. In places where the cracked leather had split open, bare flesh, unprotected by stockings, showed through. Beside them, in his neat gray cycling costume, Riley must have appeared utterly out of place, a figure from another world. And perhaps he was. After a brisk walk of nearly 20 minutes, during which they passed one or two men, sometimes small groups, all dressed in the same strange fashion as his escorts, the party followed the road up a gentle incline. They rounded a wooded bend to the left, and then, quite suddenly, and entirely without warning, the scene opened before them. Riley stopped breathing. Before him stood what was unmistakably a military encampment. Not a small gathering, not a temporary camp, but an entire village, rows upon rows of small log huts stretching across the clearing. Between the buildings, muskets were stacked in hundreds of places. The air seemed alive with movement. Soldiers moved lazily through the streets. Some gathered around crackling fires, others marching in platoons beneath the stern supervision of ragged but resolute officers. Everywhere he looked, three-corner hats, spike-tailed blue coats, knee breeches. The sight was overwhelming. Over to one side, on a slight rise overlooking the road they had just traveled, he noticed something that made his heart pound harder still. A battery of field pieces, cannons, positioned carefully, concealed by trees and shrubbery, yet commanding the approach. This was no reenactment, no theatrical display. It was real, painfully real. Harry halted the procession before one of the larger log houses. The four men stood waiting. Then, a long, piercing blast of a bugle split the air. It was followed immediately by the steady roll of drums. Within moments, several companies of militia marched forward with precision. They grounded their arms and formed three sides of a hollow square around Riley and his captors. The fourth side remained open, facing the doorway of the large log house. The silence that followed was heavy. Then the door opened. From within emerged a tall figure. He stepped forward slowly, moving up the center of the square until he stood directly before Riley. The young man felt cold chills race down his back. His legs trembled beneath him. He had never known such a mingling of astonishment and dread. For standing before him, not as a portrait, not as a statue, not as some shadowy illusion, but as living flesh and blood, was General George Washington. This was no phantom. The man before him was solid, commanding, unmistakably real. Tall, straight, perfectly proportioned. His face bore the dignity and noble character Riley had seen so many times in paintings, marble busts, and statues. There could be no mistake. It was Washington. Riley's mind reeled. For a moment, he seemed incapable of thought. Then, in the most ordinary human fashion, as countless others have done when confronted by the extraordinary, he pinched himself. Hard. He was awake, fully awake. He even felt the absurd impulse to reach forward and pinch the great figure before him, to prove that he too was real. But he dare not. Instead, he stood motionless, struggling to reason it out. And slowly, as thought began to flow again, his terror eased. For reasoning, even when incomplete, lends courage. Even when much remains unexplained. The act of trying to understand steadied his knees. And so he stood, face to face with General Washington, attempting to master the impossible. The chain of strange events had begun in that deserted house. Up to the very moment he had lifted the little jug-shaped bottle and tasted its contents, Everything had been perfectly ordinary. The road, the fork, the crumbling dwelling, all natural, all rational. But the instant the peculiar liquid had touched his lips, reality had shifted. From that precise moment, nothing had gone rightly. The conclusion forced itself upon him. The drink was responsible. There had been something supernatural in it, some agency beyond explanation. Whatever its nature, it had carried him backward through time, more than a century into the past, and placed him, body and soul, within the lines of the Patriot Army wintering at Valley Forge. The thought was staggering. He might have stood there indefinitely, turning the matter over and over in his mind, muttering to himself, pinching his arm again and again, had not the tall figure before him concluded his silent inspection and spoken at last. "Who are you, sir?" The voice was calm, authoritative. "John Riley." "At your pleasure," the young man replied. Then, unable to restrain himself, he added boldly, "And who are you, sir?" The response was immediate. Harry's hard fist struck him heavily between the shoulders. "It is not for you to question the general," the ragged soldier barked. Riley's temper flared. "And it is not for you to be so gay," he snapped, returning the blow with added force. "Here, here!" The dignified figure interrupted sharply. "Fisticuffs under my very nose? No more of this. I command you both." His tone left no room for dispute. To Harry he added, firmly but without anger, "Your zeal in my behalf will be better appreciated by being less demonstrative. Blows should be struck only on the battlefield." Then, turning again to Riley, a faint smile touched his composed features. "My name is Washington. Perhaps you may have heard of me." Riley met his gaze. "I have indeed," he answered steadily, "and heard you very well spoken of, too." Encouraged by the general's slight smile, and gaining courage from his own reasoning, he ventured another question. "I think my reckoning of the day and year is badly at fault. An hour ago, I believed it to be Christmas Day. How far astray has my calculation taken me, sir?" And there, in the bitter winter air of Valley Forge, stood a young man from another century, calmly asking General Washington to correct the date. "The day is indeed Christmas Day," said the tall commander calmly, "and the year is, as you must know, the year of our Lord 1777. The word struck Riley like a physical blow. 1777. He pinched himself again. The sensation was real. Washington now turned slightly toward Harry and the others. "Why do you bring this man to me?" "He is a spy, sir," Harry answered firmly. "That is a lie." Riley broke in indignantly. "I have done nothing to warrant such a charge." "We found him in the Widow Robin's house," Harry continued, pouring strong liquor down his throat. "I had gone inside to ask information concerning the roads, which he was getting from a bottle, sir." A faint, knowing expression crossed Washington's face. "If drinking from a bottle of necessity constitutes being a spy," he observed dryly, casting a sidelong glance at some of the nearby soldiers, "I fear our camp is already a hotbed." A few uneasy shifts followed among the ranks. Then his expression hardened. He looked straight at Riley, not merely at him, but into him, as though searching for the truth beneath his skin. "Tell me," he said sharply, "is the charge true? Do you come from Howe?" The name sent another ripple of realization through Riley. General William Howe, commander of the British forces. "The charge is not true, sir," Riley replied firmly. "I come from no one. I am simply making a tour of pleasure through this part of the country, on my bicycle." Washington's brows drew together. With the country swarming with the men of two hostile armies, any tour not of absolute necessity seems ill-timed. When I set out, I knew nothing of any armies. The fact is, sir, he stopped himself. To explain the truth, to tell them he came from another century, would only deepen suspicion. "Well," Washington pressed, suspicion growing. I certainly did not know that your army, or any army, was quartered in this vicinity. He hesitated. Then, struck by an idea, added, I rode my wheel from New York. You may have come from New York, Washington said slowly, studying the strange machine beside him, though it is difficult to believe you came so far upon that singular contrivance. Where is the horse which drew the vehicle? Riley placed a hand upon the handlebars. This is the horse, sir, he said evenly. And the vehicle. The man is crazy, Harry exclaimed. Washington did not speak, but disbelief was plain upon his face. How can the thing be balanced, he asked, without being held upright by shafts from a horse's back? And how is the motive power obtained? For answer, Riley acted. In one swift motion, he mounted the bicycle. He began pedaling, at first awkwardly, then faster, circling wildly within the hollow square of soldiers. Gasps rose from the ranks. He swerved dangerously close to one line of militiamen, nearly grazing their toes. He darted toward Harry and the others, forcing them to leap aside in alarm. Even the dignified Washington himself was compelled once or twice to step smartly aside as the strange-wheeled creature threatened his equilibrium. The soldiers stared in open astonishment. The machine moved of its own accord, or so it seemed. Riley wheeled back and forth, weaving through the square, then at last slowed and dismounted, deliberately stopping against Harry's back and tumbling forward in exaggerated clumsiness. Harry fell flat to the ground. Riley landed neatly upon his feet. At once he began offering an abundance of apologies. But beneath his outward contrition, he sensed something had shifted. A seed of doubt, not of madness, but of wonder, had been planted in the minds of the Continental soldiers. And most importantly, in the mind of General Washington. You did that by design, Harry shouted, jumping to his feet. His face was red with anger, and he shook his fist threateningly at the bicyclist. Washington commanded the man to hold his peace. Then to Riley he expressed a great surprise at his performance and a desire to know more about the bicycle. The young man thereupon described the machine minutely, lifting it into the air and spinning the wheels to illustrate how smoothly they rotated. I can see it is possible to ride the contrivance with rapidity. It has been put together with wonderful ingenuity, Washington said, when Riley had replaced the wheel on the ground. And you, sir, it is but a toy, an officer spoke up. Put our friend on his bundle of tin and race him against one of our horsemen, and he would make a sorry showing. Riley smiled. I bear the gentleman no ill will for his opinion, he said. Still, I should like to show him by a practical test of the subject that his ignorance of it is most profound. You would test the speed of the machine against that of a horse. Washington said in amazement, I would, sir. You have a good road yonder. 249, with your permission and a worthy opponent, I would make the test at once. But, sir, the man is a spy, Harry broke in. Would it not be better to throw a rope around his neck and give him his deserts? The charge is by no means proven, Washington replied. Nor can it be until a court-martial convenes this afternoon. And I see no reason why we may not in the meantime enjoy the unique contest which has been suggested. It will make a pleasant break in the routine of camp life. A murmur of approval went up from the masses of men by whom they were surrounded. While they had been talking, it seemed as though everybody in the camp, not already on the scene, had gathered together behind the square of infantry. Then, sir, Harry said, with some eagerness, I would like to be the man to ride the horse. There's no better animal than mine anywhere, and I understand his tricks and humors quite well enough to put him to his best pace. I confess I have heard you well spoken of as a horseman, Washington said. Be away with you. Saddle and bridle your horse at once. It was the chain of singular circumstances narrated above which brought John Riley into the most remarkable contest of his life. He had entered many bicycle races at one time or other, always with credit to himself and to the Club 250 whose colors he wore. And he had every expectation of making a good showing today. Yet a reflection of the weird conditions which had brought about the present contest took away some of his self-possession when a few minutes later he was marched over to the turnpike and left to his own thoughts, while the officers were pacing out a 1-mile straightaway course down the road. After the measurements had been carefully taken, 2 long, unbroken lines of soldiers were formed along the entire mile of road. The precaution was obvious. Riley would have no opportunity to escape across the fields. The course was sealed. When all was ready, General Washington approached him once more. The commander extended his hand, firm, composed, and gave a brief shake. Then he leaned closer and spoke a quiet word of encouragement into Riley's ear. Having done this kindly act, he withdrew to take his position near the finish. The starting point lay close to the half-concealed battery of field pieces. Riley was escorted there. Shortly afterward, Harry arrived mounted. He sat astride a handsome black mare, 14.5 hands high, strong in limb and flank, alive with restless spirit. She pranced and tossed her head, hoofs pawing the ground. It had to be admitted the soldier rode well. He handled the animal with confidence, keeping her plunging strength confined within a remarkably small space. Harry cast a contemptuous glance at the bicyclist. He muttered something sarcastic under his breath as they lined up side by side. Riley ignored him. He believed firmly that when this contest was over, very little humor would remain in Harry's mutton-like head. "Keep to your own side of the road throughout the race," Riley cautioned calmly. "I don't wish to be collided with by your big beast." Harry smirked. "I'll give you a good share of the road at the start," he replied in derision, "and all of it, and my dust afterward." An officer raised his pistol. The first shot rang out. Riley studied the course with satisfaction. The road was wide, level, smooth, hard, straight as a line drawn by a ruler. And best of all, a strong breeze had risen, blowing squarely at his back. His will was geared to 84 inches. The wind would be a welcome ally. Awaiting the second signal, he glanced down the 2 blue ranks of soldiers stretching into the hazy distance. They converged toward a small flag planted at the end of the mile. The men stood at parade rest, but they were far from still. They craned their necks, shifted their weight, gestured excitedly. The long lines seemed almost alive, writhing like twin serpents along the road. At the finish, a dense cluster of militiamen crowded the roadway and spilled into the fields. Then, crack, the second shot. They were off. Riley shoved aside the man who had steadied his bicycle and drove down hard upon the pedals. The mare leapt forward instantly. Her hooves tore into the earth. Muscles extended. She surged ahead with a powerful snort, taking the lead at once. A roar of excitement rippled down the ranks. Riley saw hats waving, arms flung into the air as he passed. Through the rising cloud of dust ahead, he glimpsed the shadow-like form of the galloping horse. Her hoofbeats rang clear and sharp above the shouting. She pulled farther ahead. Soon 100 feet lay between them. Harry twisted in his saddle and shouted another taunt. Riley answered without lifting his head. "I shall pass you very soon. Keep to your own side of the road." He was not daunted. His head lay low over the handlebars. His back curved like the upper shell of an enormous egg. His legs pumped faster and faster, a relentless rhythm. The soldiers became blurs, twin streaks of blue rushing past on either side. Their shouts rasped in his ears like rapid musket fire. Dust filled his mouth and throat. But when he dared glance ahead again, satisfaction stirred within him. The mare was no longer increasing her lead. Indeed, The distance between them was shrinking. Slowly, surely, he was gaining. Harry turned in his saddle once more. No doubt he expected to see his opponent hopelessly behind. Instead, Riley was dangerously close. An oath burst from the soldier's lips. He lashed the mare savagely, straining every nerve and sinew. The brave animal lunged forward again, gaining several more feet. But the effort was costly. Her pace soon faltered. Riley crept up, closer than before, closer still, until his head was nearly level with the mare's streaming tail. Harry now beat the animal without restraint, cursing wildly. But the mare had already given her spurt. She could not find another. They thundered on like this, Harry whipping brutally, the mare laboring desperately, Riley clinging to her hind flanks with iron persistence, refusing to surrender a single inch. And at such speed, a mile is nothing. The finishing flag loomed only a few hundred feet ahead. Riley knew the moment had come. He ground his teeth and bent lower still over the handlebars. His legs blurred, faster than before, faster than seemed possible. Then, with a face twisted in rage, Harry swerved his horse violently across the road, directly into the path he had been warned to avoid. Gasps erupted from the ranks. What prevented catastrophe could scarcely be explained. Riley backpedaled instinctively, twisted the handlebars, lurched sideways so sharply he nearly fell. In a fraction of a second, he was across to the other side of the road and pushing ahead. The mare seemed suddenly as if standing still. The soldier's alarmed cries turned first to outrage at the treacherous maneuver, and then to a roar of unrestrained delight as Riley crossed the flag. 20 feet ahead, Victor, as he passed the line, he glimpsed General Washington standing near the flag, waving his hat with the boyish enthusiasm of a schoolboy. The sight filled him with a strange warmth. He continued beyond the finish, slowing gradually, the cheers thundering behind him. Then, the noise stopped, abruptly, as though cut away by an unseen hand. Riley turned in his saddle. The road was empty, utterly empty. Not a soldier, not a horse, not even the faintest echo of movement. He stared in disbelief. As certain as the Apostle Peter, he was alone. He turned the bicycle around and rode back slowly along the deserted highway, scanning the fields and woodland for any sign of the vanished army. Nothing. Even the finishing flag had disappeared. The breeze that had aided him was gone. The air lay calm and warm. 2 sparrows chirped peacefully in a nearby tree. No muskets, no drums, no Washington. Riley returned to the place where the encampment had stood only moments before. There were no huts, no stacked arms, no concealed cannons, only open fields to one side of the road and a quiet clump of woodland to the other. He continued down the small hill, the same hill up which Harry and his companions had marched him earlier, and followed the road back toward the fork. The old farmhouse stood there still, weathered, neglected, falling apart, exactly as it had been when he first approached it. He dismounted and entered. Dust lay thick upon the floor. The room was empty, silent. On the brick hearth before the ruined fireplace lay a scattering of broken glass, the fragments of a small, jug-shaped bottle. And with that, the question lingers. Was it a dream? A hallucination born of some strange liquor? Or had John Riley truly ridden, for one extraordinary Christmas day, beside General Washington at Valley Forge? You have just listened to the story The Ghost of Washington, a fascinating work of historical fiction blending imagination with one of the most dramatic moments in American history. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have taken a ride or left the bottle untouched? Stay with us as we continue bringing you powerful, mysterious, and unforgettable stories. Until next time, keep listening, Keep imagining.